Oh, there we go. All right. Good evening. It is time to finish up part 7 of this book. So we've got 3 somewhat longer chapters tonight. So we're going to go ahead and get them through them, and then we've got one more section to the book, part 8, which only has 3 chapters, and they are also fairly long. So it'll be another long reading next Tuesday to finish up the book. I need to figure out what what I want to read next. All right, so we are on chapter 47, Sphinx. And it starts right off with a quote from John West. Egyptologists, said John West, are the last people in the world to address any anomaly, end quote. Of course, there are many anomalies in Egypt. The one West was referring to at that moment, however, was the anomaly of the Fourth Dynasty pyramids, an anomaly because of what had happened during the Third, Fifth, and Sixth Dynasties. Zoser's Step Pyramid at Saqqara, the Third Dynasty, was an imposing edifice, but it was built with relatively small, manageable blocks that 5 or 6 men working together could carry, and its internal chambers were structurally unsound. The pyramids of the Fifth and Sixth Dynasties, although adorned inside with the beautiful pyramid text, were so poorly built and had collapsed so completely that today most of them amount to little more than mounds of rubble. The Fourth Dynasty pyramids at Giza, however, were wonderfully well made and had endured the passage of thousands of years more or less intact. It was this sequence of events, or rather its implications, that West felt Egyptologists should have paid more attention to. Quote, there's a discrepancy in the scenario that reads building kind of rubbishy pyramids that are structurally unsound, suddenly building absolutely unbelievable pyramids that are structurally the most incredible things ever conceived of, and then immediately afterwards going back to structurally unsound pyramids. It doesn't make sense. The parallel scenario in, say, the auto industry would be inventing and building the Model T Ford, then suddenly inventing and building the 1993 Porsche and making a few of those, then forgetting how to do that and going back to building Model T Fords again. Civilizations don't work this way. End quote. So what you're saying, I asked, are I'm sorry, so what are you saying? I asked. Are you saying that the Fourth Dynasty pyramids were built by the Fourth Dynasty weren't built by the Fourth Dynasty at all? My gut feeling is that they weren't. They don't look like the mastabas in front of them. They don't look like any other Fourth Dynasty stuff either. They don't seem to fit in. And nor does the Sphinx. And nor does the Sphinx. But the big difference is that we don't have to rely on gut feelings where the Sphinx is concerned. We can prove that it was built long before the Fourth Dynasty. John West. Santa and I had been fans of John Anthony West ever since we had first started traveling in Egypt. His guidebook, The Traveler's Key, had been a brilliant and indispensable introduction to the mysteries of this ancient land, and we still carried it with us. At the same time, his scholarly works, notably Serpent in the Sky, had opened our eyes to the revolutionary possibility that Egyptian civilization, with its manifold glimpses of high science apparently out of place in time, might not have developed entirely within the confines of the Nile Valley, but might have been a legacy of some earlier, greater, and as yet unidentified civilization. Quote, antedating dynastic Egypt and all other known civilizations by millennia, end quote. Tall and strongly built, West was in his early 60s. He had cultivated a neatly trimmed white beard, was dressed in a khaki safari suit, and wore an eccentric 19th century pith helmet. His manner was youthful and energetic, and there was a roguish sparkle in his eyes. The 3 of us were sitting on the open upper deck of a Nile cruiser moored off the Corniche in Luxor, just a few yards downstream from the Winter Palace Hotel. Excuse me. To our west, across the river, a big damn, sorry. Across the river, a big red sun, distorted by atmospheric refraction, was setting behind the cliffs of the Valley of the Kings. To our east lay the battered but noble ruins of the Luxor and Karnak temples. Beneath us, transmitted through the hull of the boat, we could feel the lap and flow of the water as it rolled by on its meridional course towards the far off delta. West had first presented his thesis for an older Sphinx in Serpent in the Sky, a comprehensive exposition of the work of the French mathematician R.A. Schwaller de Lubitz. Schwaller's research at the Luxor Temple between 1937 and 1952 had unearthed mathematical evidence that suggested that Egyptian science and culture had been far more advanced and sophisticated than modern scholars had appreciated. However, as West put it, this evidence had been set out in, quote, abstruse, complex, and uncompromising language. Few readers seem comfortable with raw Schwaller. It's a bit like trying to wade directly into high energy physics without extensive prior training. End quote. Schwaller's principal publications, both originally in French, were the massive 3-volume Temple de l'Homme, yeah, um, which focused on Luxor. I think that's Temple of Man, if I'm remembering my French right. I might be incorrect. Uh, which focused on Luxor. And the more general Roi de la Théocratie Pharaonique, something like that. In this latter work, subsequently translated into English as Sacred Science, Schwaller made a passing reference to the tremendous floods and rains which devastated Egypt in the 11th millennium BC. Almost as an afterthought, he added, quote, a great civilization must have preceded the vast movements of water that passed over Egypt, which leads us to assume that the Sphinx already existed, sculpted in the rock of the West Cliff at Giza, that Sphinx whose leonine body, except for the head, shows indisputable signs of water erosion. End quote. While working on Serpent, West was struck by the possible significance of this remark and decided to follow it up. Quote, I realized that if I could prove Schwaller's offhand observation empirically, this would be ironclad evidence for the existence of a previously unidentified high civilization of distant antiquity. End quote. Why? Okay, I'm a little bit confused by the quotes here. So there's another long quote, almost like they're having a conversation. I don't know. So, quote, once you've established that water was the agent that eroded the Sphinx, the answer is almost childishly simple. It can be explained to anybody who reads the National Enquirer or the News of the World. It's almost moronically simple. The Sphinx is supposed to have been built by Khafre around 2500 BC, but since the beginning of dynastic times, say 3000 BC onwards, there just hasn't been enough rain on the Giza Plateau to have caused the very extensive erosion that we see all over the Sphinx's body. Hey, Nambro, how you doing tonight? Good to see you. It's been a while. Let me finish this quote. You really have to go back to before 10,000 BC to find a wet enough climate in Egypt to account for weathering of this type and on this scale. It therefore follows that the Sphinx must have been built before 10,000 BC, and since it's a massive, sophisticated work of art, it also follows that it must have been built by a high civilization. End quote. Okay, so this is a conversation because the next one is a quote also, but it's okay. This is a little annoying, but we'll go with it. But John Santa asked, how can you be so sure that the weathering was caused by rainwater? Couldn't the desert winds have done the job just as well? After all, even Orthodox Egyptologists admit that the Sphinx has existed for nearly 5,000 years. Isn't that long enough for these effects to have been caused by wind erosion? And the answer, naturally, that was one of the first possibilities that I had to exclude. Only if I could show that wind-borne abrasive sand couldn't possibly have brought the Sphinx to its present condition would there be any point in looking further into the implications of water erosion. Robert Schoch's geology, unriddling the Sphinx. A key issue turned out to be the deep trench that the monument was surrounded by on all sides. Quote, because the Sphinx is set in a hollow, West explained, sand piles up to its neck within a few decades if it's left unattended. It has been left unattended often during historical times. In fact, through a combination of textual references and historical extrapolations, it's possible to prove that during the 4,500 years that have elapsed since it was ostensibly built by Khafre, it's been buried to its neck for as much as 3,300 years. That means that in all this time, there has only been a cumulative total of just over 1,000 years in which its body has been susceptible to wind erosion. All the rest of the time, it's been protected by the desert winds, from the desert winds, by an enormous blanket of sand. The point is that if the Sphinx was really built by Khafre in the Old Kingdom, and if wind erosion was capable of inflicting such damage on it in so short a time span, then other Old Kingdom structures in the area built out of the same limestone ought to show similar weathering, but none do. Absolutely unmistakable Old Kingdom tombs full of hieroglyphs and inscriptions. None of them show the same type of weathering as the Sphinx. End quote. Indeed, none did. Professor Robert Schoch, a Boston University geologist and specialist in rock erosion, who had played a key role in validating West's evidence, was satisfied as to the reason for this. The weathering of the Sphinx and the walls of its surrounding rock-hewn enclosure had not been caused by wind scouring at all, but by thousands of years of heavy rainfall, long ages before the Old Kingdom came into being. Having won over his professional peers at the 1992, I I'm going to pause there just for a second. That actually makes a little more sense out of the theory that the Sphinx's head has been recarved from something bigger. So, what if it was so eroded it was basically unrecognizable? And I'm just thinking out loud, and then they uh, recarved it into something that kind of resembles a pharaoh or whatever. Just a thought. Okay, back to it. Having won over his professional peers at the 1992 convention of the Geological Society of America, Schoch went on to explain his findings to a much wider and more eclectic audience, including Egyptologists, at the 1992 annual meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, AAAS. He began by pointing out to delegates that, quote, the body of the Sphinx and the walls of the Sphinx ditch are deeply weathered and eroded. This erosion is a couple of meters thick in places, at least on the walls. It's very deep, it's very old in my opinion, and it gives a rolling and undulating profile, end quote. Such undulations are easily recognizable to stratigraphers and paleontologists, as having been caused by quote unquote precipitation induced weathering. As Santha Faia's photographs of the Sphinx and the Sphinx enclosure indicate, this weathering takes the distinctive form of a combination of deep vertical fissures and undulating horizontal coves. Quote, a classic textbook example, in Schoch's words, of what happens to a limestone structure when you have rain beating down on it for thousands of years. It's clearly rain precipitation that produced these erosional features, end quote. Wind/sand erosion presents a very different profile of sharp-edged horizontal channels selectively scoured out from the softer layers of the affected rock. Under no circumstances can it cause the vertical fissures, particularly visible in the wall of the Sphinx enclosure. These could only have been quote unquote formed by water running down the wall. The result of rain falling in enormous quantities, cascading over the slope of the Giza Plateau and down into the Sphinx enclosure below. Quote, "It picked out the weak spots in the rock," Schock elaborated, "and opened them up into these fissures. Clear evidence to me as a geologist that this erosional feature was caused by rainfall." End quote. Although in some places obscured by repair blocks but put in place by numerous restorers over the passing millennia, the same observation holds true for the scooped out, undulating scalloped coves that run the entire length of the Sphinx's body. Again, these are characteristic of precipitation-induced weathering, because only long periods of heavy rainfall beating down on the upper parts of the immense structure and cascading over its sides could have produced such effects. Confirmation of this comes from the fact that the limestone out of which the Sphinx was carved is not uniform in its composition, but consists of a series of hard and soft layers in which some of the more durable rocks recede further than some of the less durable rocks. Such a profile simply could not have been produced by wind erosion, which would have selectively chiseled out the softer layers of rock, but, quote, "is entirely consistent." Wait a minute. Okay. Sorry. Sometimes these quotation marks are a little confusing the way he's got them in here. I think some of them might be typos. So, quote, "is entirely consistent with precipitation-induced weathering where you have rainwater beating down from above. The rocks higher up are the more durable ones, but they recede back further than some of the less durable rocks lower in the section, which are more protected," end quote. In his summing up at the AAAS meeting, Schock concluded, quote, "It's well known that the Sphinx enclosure fills with sand very quickly, in just a matter of decades under the desert conditions of the Sahara, and it has to be dug out periodically, and this has been the case since ancient times. Yet you still get this dramatic rolling erosional profile in the Sphinx enclosure. Simply put, therefore, what I'm suggesting is that this rolling profile, these features seen on the body and in the Sphinx ditch, hark back to a much earlier period when there was more precipitation in the area and more moisture, more rain on the Giza Plateau." End quote. As Schock admitted, he was not the first geologist to have noticed the, quote, "anomalous precipitation-induced weathering features on the core body of the Sphinx," end quote. He was, however, the first to have become involved in public debates over the immense historical implications of this weathering. His attitude was that he preferred to stick to his geology. Quote, "I've been told over and over again that the peoples of Egypt as far as we know, did not have either the technology or the social organization to cut out the core body of the Sphinx in pre-dynastic times. However, I don't see it as being my problem as a geologist. I'm not seeking to shift the burden, but it's really up to the Egyptologists and archaeologists to figure out who carved it. If my findings are in conflict with their theory about the rise of civilization, then maybe it's time for them to reevaluate that theory. I'm not saying that the Sphinx was built by Atlanteans or people from Mars or extraterrestrials. I'm just following the science where it leads me, and it leads me to conclude that the Sphinx was built much earlier than previously thought." End quote. Legendary civilizations. How much earlier? John West told us that he and Schock had quote, "a friendly debate going," end quote. Uh, Still, again, annoying, broken up quotes here. Um, friendly debate about the age of the Sphinx. Quote, Shock puts the date somewhere between 5000 BC and 7000 BC minimum, the epoch of the Neolithic subpluvial, mainly by taking the most cautious view allowed by the data at hand. As a professor of geology at a big university, he's almost constrained to take a conservative view, and it's true that there were rains between 7000 BC and 5000 BC. However, for a variety of both intuitive and scholarly reasons, I think that the date is much, much older, and that most of the weathering of the Sphinx took place in the earlier rainy period before 10,000 BC. Frankly, if it was as relatively recent as 5000 to 7000 BC, I think we'd probably have found other evidence of the civilization that carved it. A lot of evidence from that period has been found in Egypt. There are some strange anomalies within it, I'll admit, but most of it, the vast bulk, is really quite rudimentary. End quote. So, who built the Sphinx if it wasn't the pre-dynastic Egyptians? Again, conversation here. So, my conjecture is that the whole riddle is linked in some way to those legendary civilizations spoken of in all the mythologies of the world. You know, that there were great catastrophes, that a few people survived and went wandering around the earth, and that a bit of knowledge was preserved here, a bit there. My hunch is that the Sphinx is linked to all that. If I were asked to place a bet, I'd say that it predates the breakup of the last ice age and is probably older than 10,000 BC, perhaps even older than 15,000 BC. My conviction it's more than a conviction, is that it's vastly old. This was a conviction I increasingly shared, and I reminded myself that most 19th century Egyptologists had shared it too. Nevertheless, the Sphinx's appearance argued against such intuition, since there was no doubt that its head looked conventionally pharaonic. If it's as old as you think it is, I now ask John, then how do you explain that the sculptors depicted it wearing the characteristic Nemes headdress and uraeus of dynastic times? I'm not bothered about that. In fact, as you know, Egyptologists contend that the face of the Sphinx resembles the face of Khafre. It's one of the reasons why they claim it must have been built by him. Schock and I have looked into this very carefully. We think, from the proportions of the head relative to the rest of the body, that it's been recarved during dynastic times, and that's why it looks very dynastic. But we don't think it was ever meant to represent Khafre. As part of our ongoing research into these issues, we had Lieutenant Frank Domingo, a forensic artist with the New York Police Department, come over and do point-by-point comparisons between the face of the Sphinx and the face of Seffrin's statue in the Cairo Museum. His conclusion was that in no way was the Sphinx ever intended to represent Khafre. It's not just a matter of it being a different face, it's probably a different race. So this is a very ancient monument that was recarved at a much later date. Originally, it may not even have had a human face. Maybe it started out as a lion's face as well as a lion's body, which would make sense. Magellan and the first dinosaur bone. After my own explorations at Giza, I was interested to know whether West's research had cast doubt on the orthodox dating of any of the other monuments on the plateau, particularly the so-called Valley Temple of Khafre. More conversation. We think there's quite a lot of stuff that may be older, he told me. Not just the Valley Temple, but also the mortuary temple up the hill, probably something to do with the Menkaure complex, maybe even the Pyramid of Khafre. What is the Menkaure complex? Well, the mortuary temple, and actually I'm only using the conventional attribution of the pyramids for convenience here. Okay, so do you think it's possible that the pyramids are as old as the Sphinx too? It's hard to say. I think something was there where those pyramids now are because of the geometry. The Sphinx was part of a master plan, and the Khafre pyramid is maybe the most interesting in that respect because it was definitely built in two stages. If you look at it, maybe you've noticed, you'll see that its base consists of several courses of gigantic blocks, similar in style to the blocks of the core masonry of the Valley Temple. Superimposed above the base, the rest of the pyramid is composed of smaller, less precisely engineered stuff. But when you look at it, knowing what you're looking for, you can instantly you you see instantly that it's built in two separate bits. I mean, I can't help but feel that the vast blocks on the bottom date from the earlier period, from the time the Sphinx was built, and that the second part was added later, but even then, not necessarily by Khafre. As you go into this, you begin to realize that the more you learn, the more complex everything becomes. For example, there may even have been an intermediate civilization which actually could correspond to the Egyptian texts. They talk themselves about two long they talk themselves about two long prior periods. In the first of these, Egypt was supposedly ruled by the gods, the Neteru, and in the second, it was ruled by the Shemsu-Hor, the the companions of Horus. So, as I say, the problems just get more and more complicated. Fortunately, however, the bottom line stays simple. The bottom line is the Sphinx wasn't built by Khafre. The geology proves that it's a hell of a lot older. Nevertheless, the Egyptologists won't accept that it is. One of the arguments they've used against you, Mark Lehner did so, goes something like this. If the Sphinx was made before 10,000 BC, then why can't you show us the rest of the civilization that built it? In other words, why don't you have any other evidence to put forward for the presence of your legendary lost civilization apart from a few structures on the Giza Plateau? What do you say to that? First off, there are structures outside Giza. For example, the Osirian in Abydos, where you've just come from. We think that amazing edifice may relate to our work on the Sphinx. Even if the Osirian didn't exist, however, the absence of other evidence wouldn't worry me. I mean, to make a big deal out of the fact that further confirmatory evidence hasn't been found yet, and to use this to try to scuttle the arguments for an older Sphinx is completely illogical. Analogously, it's like saying to Magellan, where are the other guys who sailed around the world? Of course it's still flat. Or in 1838, when the first dinosaur bone was found, they would have said, of course there's no such thing as a giant extinct animal. Where's the rest of the skeletons? They've only found one bone. But once a few people begin to realize that this bone could only be from an extinct animal, within 20 years the museums of the world were filled up with complete dinosaur skeletons. So it's sort of like that. Nobody's thought to look in the right places. I'm absolutely certain that other evidence will be found once a few people start looking in the right places. Along the banks of the ancient Nile, for example, which is miles from the present Nile, or even at the bottom of the Mediterranean, which was dry during the last ice age. And it was. Um, I don't remember where I read about that, but they've talked about how going into the Mediterranean from the Atlantic, there's sort of a wall of rock that crosses right where Gibraltar is, and at some point, um, that actually broke down and allowed the ocean to flood in and cover up all of what is now the Mediterranean. So um, that is where you get some of the theories, some of them written in fiction, like in the Conan books about Hyperborea, and that was supposed to be in that area um, when there was no Mediterranean Sea. Anyway, I think it's Hyperborea. I may be using the wrong name there, but I'm pretty sure that's it. The problem of transmission. I asked John West why he thought that Egyptologists and archaeologists were so unwilling to consider that the Sphinx might be a clue to the existence of a forgotten episode in human history. The reason I think this is that they're quite fixed in their ideas about the linear evolution of civilization. They find it hard to come to terms with the notion that there might have been people more than 12,000 years ago who were more sophisticated than we are today. The Sphinx and the geology, which proves its antiquity, and the fact that the technology that was involved in making it is in many ways almost beyond our own capacities, contradicts the belief that civilization and technology have evolved in a straightforward linear way. Because even with the best modern technology, we almost couldn't carry out the various tasks that were involved in the project. The Sphinx itself, that's not such a staggering feat. I mean, if you get enough sculptors to cut the stone away, they could carve a statue a mile long. The technology was involved in taking the stones, quarrying the stones to free the Sphinx from its bedrock, and then in moving those stones and using them to build the Valley Temple a couple of 100 feet away. And just as a side note, talking about non-linear, just as a thought experiment, think about this. What if civilization ended today? Everything was just wiped out. Um, Massive solar flare, whatever. Electricity's gone. Can't get it back. At least not for a very, very long time. Um, and let's just say all of the modern convenient things that were that we have now eventually wear out and are gone. Um, could anybody, except for a very few people, um, create like this is total, you know, speculation, whatever. But how could more than a handful of people chip out really good quality like stone tools? I couldn't. I could make something that worked, but it would be, Olduvai Gorge level stuff at first till I got better at it. So that's just an example, hypothetical example of um, if everything was wiped out or there was a massive flood that took everything and just scoured the surface of the earth and it's all just gone, but you survived beyond picking up a sharp rock to cut things. What skill do you have in creating, you know, everything you would need? Um, I think that to me is kind of what they're talking about. Um, anyway, that's just me. That's how my brain works. All right, back to it. This was news to me. You mean that the 200-ton blocks in the Valley Temple walls were quarried right out of the Sphinx enclosure? Yes, no doubt about it. Geologically, they're from the identical member of rock. They were quarried out, moved over to the site of the temple, God knows how, and erected into 40-foot high walls. Again, God knows how. I'm talking about the huge limestone core blocks, not the granite facing. I think that the granite was added much later, quite possibly by Khafre. But if you look at the limestone core blocks, you'll see that they bear the marks of exactly the same kind of precipitation-induced weathering that are found on the Sphinx. So the Sphinx and the core structure of the Valley Temple were made at the same time by the same people, whoever they may have been. And do you think that these people and the later dynastic Egyptians were connected to each other in some way? In Serpent in the Sky, you suggested that a legacy must have been passed on. It's still just a suggestion. All that I know for sure on the basis of our work on the Sphinx is that a very, very high, sophisticated civilization capable of undertaking construction projects on a grand scale was present in Egypt in the very distant past. Then there was a lot of rain. Then, thousands of years later, in the same place, pharaonic civilization popped up, already fully formed, apparently out of nowhere, with all its knowledge complete. That much we can be certain of. But whether or not the knowledge that ancient Egypt possessed was the same as the knowledge that produced the Sphinx, I really can't say. How about this, I speculated. The civilization that produced the Sphinx wasn't based here, at least not originally. It wasn't in Egypt. It put the Sphinx here as some sort of a marker or outpost. Perfectly possible. Could be that the Sphinx of that civilization was like, let's say, what Abu Simbel in Nubia was for dynastic Egypt. Then that civilization came to an end, was extinguished by some sort of massive catastrophe, and that's when the legacy of high knowledge was handed on. Because they had the Sphinx here and they knew about Egypt, they knew this place, they knew this country, they had a connection here. Maybe people survived the ending of that civilization, maybe they came here. Does that work for you? Well, it's a possibility. Again, going back into the mythologies and legends of the world, many of them tell of such a catastrophe and of the few people, the Noah story that's prevalent through endless civilizations, who somehow or other retained and passed on knowledge. The big problem with all this, from my point of view, is the transmission process. How exactly the knowledge does get handed on during the thousands and thousands of years between the construction of the Sphinx and the flowering of dynastic Egypt. Theoretically, you're sort of stuck, aren't you? With this vast period in which the knowledge has to be transmitted, this is not easy to slough off. On the other hand, we do know that those legends we're referring to, were passed on word for word over countless generations. And in fact, oral transmission is a much surer means of transmission than written transmission because the language may change, but as long as whoever's telling the story tells it true in whatever the language of the time is, it surfaces some 5,000 years later in its original form. But maybe there are ways in secret societies and religious cults, or through mythology, for example, that the knowledge could have been preserved and passed on before flowering again. The point, I think, with problems as complex and important as this, is simply not to dismiss any possibilities, no matter how outrageous they may at first seem, without investigating them very, very thoroughly. Second opinion. John West was in Luxor, leading a study group on Egypt's sacred sites. Early the next day, he and his students went south to Aswan and Abu Simbel. Santha and I journeyed north again, back towards Giza and the mysteries of the Sphinx and the pyramids. We were to meet there with the archaeoastronomer Robert Bovell. As we shall see, his stellar correlations provided startling, independent corroboration for the geological evidence of Giza's vast antiquity. And that is finally the end of chapter 47. 48 is a little bit longer. We do, however, have a picture on the second page. It's upside down, I think. Yeah, it's upside down. I don't know why he does that. Normally you put north up on a map. He doesn't hold to that. But whatever. Chapter 48, Earth Measurers. Follow these instructions carefully. Draw two parallel straight lines vertically down a sheet of paper, about 7 inches long and a bit under 3 inches apart. Throw a third line also vertical, also parallel, and of equal length exactly midway between the first two. Write the letter S for south at the top end of your diagram, the end furthest away from you, and the letter N for north at the bottom end. Add the letters E for east and W for west in their appropriate positions at either side of the diagram, to your left for east and to your right for west. What you're looking at are the outlines of a geometrical map of Egypt, incorporating a perspective very different from our own, where north is always equated with up. Okay, that's why he's doing it. This map, where up is south, seems to have been worked out an enormously long time ago by cartographers with a scientific understanding of the shape and size of our planet. Okay, I get you now. To complete the map, you should now mark a dot on the center of the three parallel lines about an inch to the south of up from the northern end of the diagram. Then draw two more lines diagonally down from this point, respectively to the northeast and northwest, until they reach the northern ends of the two outermost parallel lines. Finally, link these parallel lines directly with horizontal lines running east to west at the northern and southern ends of the diagram. Sorry. Um, the shape produced is a meridional rectangle oriented north-south. This rectangle is 7 inches long by just under 3 inches wide and has a triangle demarcated at its northern lower end. The triangle represents the Nile Delta, and the dot at the apex of the triangle represents the apex of the delta. A point on the ground at 30 degrees 6 minutes north and 31 degrees 14 minutes east, very close to the location of the Great Pyramid. Okay, so now I can show you that diagram he was just describing, and it is captioned Map showing the geometric conception of Egypt with the Great Pyramid at the apex of the Nile Delta. The Egyptians traditionally thought of south as up. Okay, so that explains it. I did not know that about the Egyptians. So here we go. Here is our upside down map. This is the delta down here, which we know is to the north of Egypt, which was actually Lower Egypt. Just makes sense, you know. If Upper Egypt is the southern part and Lower Egypt is the northern part, I can understand why they would have that conception. But anyway, site of the Great Pyramid, River Nile, the longitudinal lines that he had you draw, if you were doing such a thing. Okay. Geodetic marking. Whatever else it may be, it has long been understood by mathematicians and geographers that the Great Pyramid serves the function of a geodetic marker. Geodetics being the branch of science concerned with determining the exact position of geographical points and the shape and size of the Earth. This realization first dawned in the late 18th century when the armies of revolutionary France, led by Napoleon Bonaparte, invaded Egypt. Bonaparte, who had cultivated a deep interest in the enigmas of the pyramids, brought with him a large number of scholars, 175 in all, including several graybeards gathered from various universities who were reputed to have acquired a profound knowledge of Egyptian antiquities, and more usefully, a group of mathematicians, cartographers, and surveyors. One of the tasks the savants were set after the conquest was complete was to draw up detailed maps of Egypt. In the process of doing this, they discovered that the Great Pyramid was perfectly aligned to true north, and of course to the south, east, and west as well, as we saw in part 6. This meant that the mysterious structure made an excellent reference and triangulation point, and a decision was therefore taken to use the meridian passing through its apex as the baseline for all other measurements and orientations. The team then proceeded to produce the first accurate maps of Egypt drawn up in the modern age. When they had finished, they were intrigued to note that the Great Pyramid's meridian sliced the Nile Delta region into two equal halves. They also found that if the diagonals running from the pyramid's apex to its northeastern and northwestern corners were extended, forming lines on the map running northeast and northwest until they reached the Mediterranean, the triangle thus formed would neatly encapsulate the entire delta area. Let us now return to our map, which also incorporates a triangle representing the delta. Its other main components are the three parallel meridians. The eastern meridian is at longitude 32 degrees 38 minutes east, the official eastern border of ancient Egypt from the beginning of the dynastic times. The western meridian is at longitude 29 degrees 50 minutes east, the official western border of ancient Egypt. The central meridian is at longitude 31 degrees 14 minutes east, exactly midway between the other two. 1 degree 24 minutes away from each. What we now have is a representation of a strip on the surface of planet Earth that is exactly 2 degrees 48 minutes wide. How long is this strip? Ancient Egypt's official northern and southern borders, which bore no more relationship to settlement patterns than the official eastern and western boundaries, are marked by the horizontal lines at the top and bottom of the map and are located respectively at 31 degrees 6 minutes north and 24 degrees 6 minutes north. The northern border, 31 degrees 6 minutes north, joins the two outer ends of the estuary of the Nile. The southern border, 24 degrees 6 minutes north, marks the precise latitude of the island of Elephantine at Aswan, Seyna, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, Seyne, where an important astronomical and solar observatory was located throughout known Egyptian history. It seems that this archaic land, sacred since time began, the creation and habitation of the gods, was originally conceived of as a geometric construct exactly 7 terrestrial degrees in length. Within this construct, the Great Pyramid appears to have been carefully sited as a geodetic marker for the apex of the delta. The latter, which we have indicated on our map, is located at 30 degrees 6 minutes north, 31 degrees 14 minutes east. A point in the middle of the Nile at the northern edge of modern Cairo. Meanwhile, the pyramid stands at latitude of 30 degrees north, corrected for atmospheric refraction, and at longitude 31 degrees 9 minutes east, an error of just a few minutes of terrestrial arc to the south and west. This error, however, does not appear to have resulted from sloppiness or inaccuracy on the part of the pyramid builders. On the contrary, a close look at the topography of the area suggests that the explanation should be sought in the need to find a site suitable for all the astronomical observations that had to be taken for accurate setting out, and with a sufficiently stable geological structure on which to park forever a 6 million ton monument almost 500 feet high with a footprint of over 13 acres. The Giza Plateau fits the bill on all counts, close to the apex of the delta, elevated above the valley of the Nile, and equipped with an excellent foundation of solid limestone bedrock. Doing things by degrees. We were driving north from Luxor to Giza in the back of Muhammad Walili's Peugeot 504, a journey of just over 4 degrees of longitude, i.e., from 25 degrees 42 minutes north to the 30th parallel, between Asyut and El Minya, a corridor of conflict in recent months between Islamic extremists, and Egyptian government forces. We were provided with an armed escort of soldiers, one of whom wore plain clothes and sat in the passenger seat beside Muhammad, fondling an automatic pistol. The others, about a dozen men armed with AK-47 assault rifles, were distributed equally between two pickup trucks, which sandwiched us front and rear. Dangerous people live here, Mohammed had confided out of the corner of his mouth when we had been stopped at a roadblock in Asyut and ordered to wait for our escort. Now, although obviously rattled at being obliged to match the high speed of the escorting vehicles, he seemed to relish the kudos of being part of an impressive convoy. Lights flashing and sirens wailing, weaving in and out of the slower traffic on the main highway from Upper to Lower Egypt. I looked out of the car window for a while at the unchanging spectacle of the Nile, at its fertile green banks and the red haze of the deserts a few miles away to east and west. This was Egypt, the real organic Egypt of today and yesterday, which overlapped but spread out far beyond. The strange official Egypt of the map described a particular fiction exactly 7 terrestrial degrees in length. In the 19th century, the renowned Egyptologist Ludwig Borchardt expressed what is still the conventional wisdom of his colleagues when he remarked, quote, "One must absolutely exclude the possibility that the ancients may have measured by degrees." End quote. This was a judgment that seemed increasingly unlikely to be tenable. Whoever they may have been, it was obvious that the original planners and architects of the Giza necropolis had belonged to a civilization which knew the earth to be a sphere, knew its dimensions almost as well as we do ourselves, and had divided it into 360 degrees, just as we do today. The proof of this lay in the creation of a symbolic official country exactly 7 terrestrial degrees in length, and in the admirably geodetic location and orientation to the cardinal points of the Great Pyramid. Equally persuasive was the fact already touched on in Chapter 23 that the perimeter of the pyramid's base stood in the relationship 2 pi to its height, and that the entire monument seemed to have been designed to serve as a map projection on a scale of 1 to 43,200 of the northern hemisphere of our planet. Hey, Vesper, how you doing tonight? Glad to see you come in. Been a while since I saw you. The Great Pyramid was a projection on 4 triangular surfaces. The apex represented the pole and the perimeter represented the equator. This is the reason why the perimeter is in relation 2 pi to the height. Good, good, he says. Glad to hear it. The pyramid-Earth ratio. We have demonstrated the use of pi in the pyramid and need not go into this matter again. Besides, the existence of the pi relationship, though interpreted as accidental by Orthodox scholars, is not contested by them. But are we seriously supposed to accept that the monument could also be a representation of the northern hemisphere of the Earth projected on flat surfaces at a scale of 1 to 43,200? Let us remind ourselves of the figures. According to the best modern estimates based on satellite observations, the equatorial circumference of the Earth is 24,902.45 miles, and its polar radius is 39. Let me reread that. 3,949.921 miles. The perimeter of the Great Pyramid's base is 3,023.16 feet, and its height is 481.3949 feet. The scaling down, as it turns out, is not absolutely exact, but it is very near. Moreover, when we remember the bulge at the Earth's equator, our planet being an oblate spheroid rather than a perfect sphere, the results achieved by the pyramid builders seem even closer to 1 to 43,200. How close? If we take the Earth's equatorial circumference, 24,902.45 miles, and scale it down, divide it by 43,200, we get a result of 0.5764 of a mile. There are 5,280 feet in a mile. The next step, therefore, is to multiply 0.5764 by 5280, which produces a figure of 3,043.39 feet. The Earth's equatorial circumference, scaled down 43,200 times, is therefore 3,043.39 feet. By comparison, as we have seen, the perimeter of the Great Pyramid's base is 3,023.16 feet. This represents an error of only 20 feet, or about 0.75%. Given the razor-sharp accuracy of the pyramid builders, however, who normally work to even finer tolerances, the error is less likely to have resulted from mistakes in the construction of the giant monument than in an underestimation of our planet's true circumference by just 163 miles, probably caused in part by failure to take account of the equatorial bulge. Let us now consider the Earth's polar radius of 3,949.921 miles. If we scale it down 43,200 times, we get 0.0914 of a mile, 482.59 feet. The Earth's polar radius scaled down 43,200 times is therefore 482.59 feet. By comparison, the Great Pyramid's height is 481.3949 feet, just a foot less than the ideal figure, an error of barely 1/5 of 1%. As near as makes no difference, therefore, the perimeter. What? This is a weird sentence. Sorry. As near as makes no difference, therefore the perimeter of the Great Pyramid's base is indeed 1 to 43,200 of the equatorial circumference of the Earth. And as near as makes no difference, the height of the Great Pyramid above the base is indeed 1 to 43,200 of the polar radius of the Earth. In other words, during all the centuries of darkness experienced by Western civilization, when knowledge of our planet's dimensions was lost to us, all we ever needed to do to rediscover that knowledge was to measure the height and base perimeter of the Great Pyramid and multiply by 43,200. How likely is this to be an accident? The common sense answer is not very likely at all, since it should be obvious to any reasonable person that what we are looking at could only be the result of a deliberate and carefully calculated planning decision. Common sense, however, has never been a faculty held in high esteem by Egyptologists, and it is therefore necessary to ask whether there is anything else in the data which might confirm that the ratio of 1 to 43,200 is a purposeful expression of intelligence and knowledge rather than some numerical fluke. The ratio itself seems to provide that confirmation, for the simple reason that 43,200 is not a random number, like, say, 45,000 or 47,000 or 50,500 or 38,800. On the contrary, it is one of a series of numbers and multiples of those numbers which relate to the phenomenon of precession of the equinoxes, and which have become embedded in archaic myths all around the world. As a reader can confirm by glancing back at Part 5, the basic numerals of the pyramid to Earth ratio crop up again and again in those myths, sometimes directly as 43,200, sometimes as 432 or 4,320 or 432,000, as 4,320,000, and so on. What we appear to be confronted by are two remarkable propositions back to back, as though designed to reinforce one another. It is surely remarkable enough that the Great Pyramid should be able to function as an accurate scale model of the northern hemisphere of planet Earth, but it is even more remarkable that the scale involved should incorporate numbers relating precisely to one of the key planetary mechanisms of the Earth. This is the fixed and apparently eternal precession of its axis of rotation around the pole of the ecliptic, a phenomenon which causes the vernal point to migrate around the band of the zodiac at the date of 1 degree every 72 years, and 30 degrees, one complete zodiacal constellation, every 2,160 years. Precession through two zodiacal constellations, or 60 degrees along the ecliptic, takes 4,320 years. The constant repetition of these precessional numbers in ancient myths could perhaps be a coincidence. Viewed in isolation, the appearance of the precessional number 43,200 in the pyramid Earth ratio might also be a coincidence, although the odds against this must be astronomical. But when we find the precessional numbers in both these very different media, the ancient myths and the ancient monument, it really does strain credulity to to suppose that the coincidence is all that is involved here. Moreover, just as the Teutonic myth of Valhalla's walls leads us to the processional number 432,000 by inviting us to calculate the warriors who, quote unquote, go to war with the wolf, 500 plus 40 multiplied by 800, as we saw in chapter 33, so the Great Pyramid leads us to the processional number 43,200 by demonstrating through the pi relationship that it might be a scale model part of the Earth, and then by inviting us to calculate that scale. Matching fingerprints. At El Minya, our escort vehicles left us through the plane, though the plainclothes soldier in the front seat stayed with us until Cairo. We paused for a late lunch of bread and falafel in a boisterous, noisy village, then motored north again. Throughout all this, my thoughts remained focused on the Great Pyramid. Obviously, it was not an accident that so immense and conspicuous a structure should occupy a key geographic and geodetic location in a part of the world that appeared bizarrely to have been conceived of and geometrized as a rectangular, symbolic construct exactly 7 terrestrial degrees in length. But it was the pyramid's other function as a three-dimensional map projection of the northern hemisphere that particularly interested me because it suggested a match with the ancient but advanced maps of the world described in Part 1. Those maps, which made use of spherical trigonometry and a range of sophisticated projections, had been claimed by Professor Charles Hapgood to provide tangible documentary evidence that an advanced civilization with a comprehensive knowledge of the globe must have flourished during the last ice age. Now here was the Great Pyramid proving to have a cartographic function vis-a-vis the northern hemisphere, and also incorporating a sophisticated projection, as one expert explained. Quote, each flat face of the pyramid was designed to represent one curved quarter of the northern hemisphere, or spherical quadrant of 90 degrees. To project a spherical quadrant onto a flat triangle correctly, the arc or base of the quadrant must be the same length as the base of the triangle, and both must have the same height. This happens to be the case only with a cross-section or meridian bisection of the Great Pyramid, whose slope angle gives the pi relation between height and base. End quote. I just had a sudden thought. You know how the Great Pyramid is there and the casing stones are missing for the most part? Just a wild thought. If it really was a representation of the northern hemisphere, what if on those casing stones there was a carving a carved map of the land masses of the Northern Hemisphere. I mean, there's no way to ever prove that, but it's just an interesting thought. Was it possible that surviving copies and compilations of ancient maps, like the Piri Reis map, for example, might in some cases go back to source documents produced by the same culture that skillfully incorporated its knowledge of the globe into the dimensions of the Great Pyramid, and indeed into the carefully geometrized dimensions of ancient Egypt itself? I could hardly forget that Charles Hapgood and his team had spent months trying to work out where the original projection of the Piri Reis map had been centered. The answer they finally obtained was Egypt, and specifically Sain. I'm not sure how to pronounce that word. Aswan in Upper Egypt, which is in the south if you didn't know that, where, as we have seen, an important astronomical observatory was situated at latitude 24 degrees 6 minutes north, the official southern border. Needless to say, precise astronomical observations would have been essential for calculations of the circumference of the Earth and of latitude positions, but for how long before the historical period had the ancient Egyptians and their ancestors been making such observations, and had they indeed learned this skill, as they stated forthrightly in their traditions, from the gods who had once walked among them? Okay, we are nearing the end. We've got a few more pages of this chapter, and then we've got one more long chapter to go through tonight. So before I get into this next section, Navigators in the Boat of Millions of Years, I am going to go refill my water glass because I'm going to need it. I can feel my throat is not happy. If you don't talk in nonstop for an hour at a time while reading like this, you don't get how it really wears on your voice. So, all right, here we go. I'm gonna go ahead and put us on the "Be Right Back" screen, and I will be right back. Okay, back to reading. Whoopsh, get back to work. All right. Navigators in the boat of millions of years. The god believed by the ancient Egyptians to have taught the principle of astronomy to their ancestors was Thoth, or Toth, or Thoth, however you prefer to pronounce it. Quote, he who reckons in heaven the counter of the stars, the enumerator of the earth, and of what is therein, and the measurer of the earth, end quote. Normally depicted as a man wearing an ibis, whatever, mask, Thoth was a leading member of the elite company of first-time deities, meaning first time like the beginning of time. Who dominated religious life in ancient Egypt from the beginning to the end of its civilization. These were the great gods, the Neteru. Although they were believed in one sense to be self-created, it was also openly acknowledged and understood that they had a special connection of some kind with another land, a fabulous and far-off country referred to in the ancient text as Ta Neteru, the land of the gods, quote unquote. Ta Neteru was thought to have had a definite earthly location a very long way south of ancient Egypt, seas and oceans away, farther even than the spice country of Punt, which probably lay along East Africa's Somali coast. To confuse matters, however, Punt was also spoken of sometimes as the divine land, or God's land, and was the source of the sweet-smelling frankincense and myrrh especially favored by the gods. Yeah, and ibis or ibis is a bird. I know that. I just don't know how to pronounce the word. Is it ibis or is it ibis? I don't know. But thank you for that anyway. Another mythical paradise was also linked to the Neteru, an abode of the blessed, where the best of humans were sometimes taken, which was believed to be, quote, situated away beyond a long expanse of water, end quote. As Wallace Budge observed in his important study, Osiris and the Egyptian Resurrection, quote, the Egyptians believed that this land could only be reached by means of a boat or by the personal help of the gods who were thought to transport their favorites thither, end quote. Those lucky enough to gain entry would find themselves in a magical garden consisting of, quote, islands interconnected by canals filled with running water which caused them to be always green and fertile, end quote. On the islands in this garden, quote, I hate it when they do these multiple quotes in short order. Quote, the wheat grew to a height of 5 cubits, the ears being 2 cubits long, and the stalks 3, and the barley grew to a height of 7 cubits, the ears being 3 cubits long, and the stalks 4, end quote. Okay. I grew up poor. I learned how to pronounce things from reading them, not hearing them. Yeah, same here. A lot of the words that I read, I'm just making my best guess at it because I've only ever seen it in written form. I've never heard it said. So if I butcher the pronunciation of something, that's just the way it is. Till I actually hear it, I don't know. I can't know. Um, and even then, I don't always change my um, pronunciation of it. Anyway, was it from a land such as this, superbly irrigated and scientifically farmed, that the agriculture bringer Osiris, whose title was President of the Land of the South, had voyaged to Egypt at the dawn of the first time? And was it from a land such as this, accessible only by boat, that I'm going to say ibis masked Thoth, which is I know exactly what that one looks like. It's a fairly small head with a really long, thin, hooked beak. I think it's a water bird, kind of like a not like a flamingo type thing, but like uh, uh, what am I trying to say? A heron kind of thing, but it's got a really long, thin beak. I'm not totally sure on that. Ibis masked Thoth had also made his way across seas and oceans to deliver the priceless gifts of astronomy and earth measurement to the primitive inhabitants of the prehistoric Nile Valley. Whatever the truth beyond the tradition, Thoth was remembered and revered by the ancient Egyptians as the inventor of mathematics, astronomy, and engineering. Quote, it was his will and power, according to Wallace Budge, that were believed to keep the forces of heaven and earth in equilibrium. It was his great skill in celestial mathematics that made proper use of the laws upon which the foundation and maintenance of the universe rested. End quote. Thoth was also credited with teaching the ancestral Egyptians the skills of geometry and land surveying, medicine, and botany. He was believed to have been the inventor, quote, of figures, of the letters of the alphabet, and the arts of reading and writing, end quote. And he was the great lord of magic who could move objects with the power of his voice. Quote, the author of every work on every branch of knowledge, both human and divine, end quote. It was to the teachings of Thoth, which they guarded jealously in their temples and claimed to have been handed down from generation to generation in the form of 42 books of instruction, that the ancient Egyptians ascribed their world-renowned wisdom and knowledge of the skies. This knowledge was spoken of almost in awe by the classical commentators who visited Egypt from the 5th century BC onwards. Herodotus, the earliest of these travelers, noted, quote, the Egyptians were the first to discover the solar year and to portion out its course into 12 parts. It was an observation of the course of the stars which led them to adopt this division. End quote. Plato, 4th century BC, reported that the Egyptians had observed the stars, quote, for 10,000 years, end quote. And later, in the 1st century BC, Diodorus Siculus left this more detailed account. Quote, the positions and arrangements of the stars as well as their motions have always been the subject of careful observation among the Egyptians. From ancient times to this day they have preserved the records concerning each of these stars over an incredible number of years. End quote. Why should the ancient Egyptians have cultivated an almost obsessional interest in the long-term observation of the stars, and why in particular should they have kept records of their movements, quote, over an incredible number of years, end quote. Such detailed observations would not have been necessary if their only interest, as a number of scholars have seriously suggested, had been agriculture. The need to predict the seasons, which any country-born person can do, there must have been some other purpose. Moreover, how did the ancient Egyptians get started on astronomy in the first place? It is not an obvious hobby for a valley-dwelling, landlocked people to develop on their own initiative. Perhaps we should take more seriously the explanation they themselves offer, that their ancestors were taught the study of the stars by a god. We might also pay closer attention to the many unmistakably maritime references in the pyramid texts, and could be there could be important new inferences to draw from ancient Egyptian religious art, in which the gods are shown traveling in beautiful, high-prowed, streamlined ships, built to the same advanced ocean-going specifications as the pyramid boats at Giza and the mysterious fleet moored in the desert sands at Abydos. Landlocked people do not, as a rule, become astronomers. Seafaring people do. Is it not possible that the maritime iconography of the ancient Egyptians, the design of their ships, and also their splendid obsession with observing the stars, could have been part of an inheritance passed on to their ancestors by an unidentified seafaring navigating race in remote prehistory? It is really only such an archaic race, such a forgotten maritime civilization, that could have left its fingerprints behind in the form of maps which accurately depict the world as it looked before the end of the last ice age. It is really only such a civilization steering its course by the stars for 10,000 years, quote unquote, that could have observed and accurately timed the phenomenon of equinoctial precession with the exactitude attested in the ancient myths, and although hypothetical, it is only such a civilization that could have measured the earth with sufficient precision to have arrived at the dimensions scaled down in the Great Pyramid. The signature of a distant date. Didn't the Greeks no, not the ones he's talking about. He's not talking about the Greek maps. He's talking about things like the Piri-Reis map that far predates any of that. Yeah, that's part of what he's talked about. That they calculated the size of the Earth through um, celestial observations. The signature of a distant date. It was almost midnight by the time we reached Giza. We checked into the Siag, a hotel with an excellent pyramid view, and sat out on our balcony as the three stars of Orion's belt tracked slowly across the southern heavens. It was the disposition of these three stars, as archaeoastronomer Robert Bovell had recently demonstrated, that served as the celestial template for the site plan of the three Giza pyramids. This in itself was a remarkable discovery, suggesting a far higher level of observational astronomy and of surveying and setting out skills than scholars had attributed to the ancient Egyptians. Even more remarkable, however, and the reason that I had arranged to meet him at Giza the next morning, was Bovell's contention that the pattern traced out on the ground in almost 15 million tons of perfectly dressed stone matched exactly the pattern in the sky during the epoch of 10,450 BC. I think they had spaceships personally. Um, eh, well, that argument can be made. I mean, have you ever heard of the Vimana aircraft? Um, if those were real, they could have been that old. If Bovell was correct, the pyramid had been devised using the changes, precession effects in the position of the stars as the permanent architectural signature of the 11th millennium BC. Okay, so that is the end of that chapter, finally. And then this last chapter for tonight is even longer. So I'm hoping there are a few pictures. Well, there's two. Okay, that always helps. Those pictures are a good little break. All right, so chapter 49, the last chapter in part 7 of the book, um, is titled The Power of the Thing. And if you haven't read this book, be aware that he is talking about present times. He was writing this in the mid 90s. So he's talking about something being a brand new discovery in 1992 or 93. That's because he was writing it in about 94-ish. So I don't remember the exact year, but that's about when it was. So here we go. On a scale of 1 to 43,200, the Great Pyramid serves as a model and map projection of the northern hemisphere of the Earth. What absolutely excludes the possibility that this could be a coincidence is the fact that the scale involved is keyed in numerically to the rate of precession of the equinoxes, one of Earth's most characteristic planetary mechanisms. It is therefore clear that we are confronted here by the manifestation of a deliberate planning decision, one intended to be recognized as such by any culture which had acquired A, an accurate knowledge of the dimensions of the Earth, and B, an accurate knowledge of the rate of precessional motion. Okay, I was just looking at what Nambro said. Super Nam! Thanks to the work of Robert Bovell, we can now be certain that another deliberate planning decision was implemented in the Great Pyramid, which, it is increasingly apparent, must be understood as a device designed to fulfill many different functions. In this case, the plan was a truly ambitious one involving the second and third pyramids as well, but it bears the fingerprints of the same ancient architects and builders who conceived of the Great Pyramid as a scale model of the Earth. Their hallmark seems to have been precession, perhaps because they liked its mathematical regularity and predictability, and they used precision to devise a plan which could be understood properly only by a scientifically advanced culture. Ours is such a culture, and Robert Bovell is the first to have worked out the basic parameters of the plan, a discovery for which he has received public acclaim and will in due course get the scientific recognition he deserves. Belgian by nationality, born and brought up in Alexandria, he is tall, lean, clean-shaven, 40-something, and doing a little and going a little thin on top. His most notable feature is a stubborn lower jaw, which characterizes his tenacious, inquiring personality. He speaks with a hybrid French-Egyptian-English accent and is decidedly Oriental in manner. He has a first-class mind and is always restlessly accumulating and analyzing new data relevant to his interests, finding new ways to look at old problems. In the process, entirely by accident, he has succeeded in transforming himself into a kind of magician of esoteric knowledge. The Orion Mystery. The booth. Sorry. I hate it when I do that. The roots of Bovell's discoveries at Giza go back to the 1960s when the Egyptologist and architect Dr. Alexander Badawi and the American astronomer Virginia Trimble demonstrated that the southern shaft of the King's Chamber in the Great Pyramid was targeted like a gun barrel on the belt of Orion during the Pyramid Age, around 2600 to 2400 BC. Bovell decided to test the southern shaft of the Queen's Chamber, which Badawi and Trimble had not investigated, and established that it had been sighted on the star Sirius during the Pyramid Age. The evidence that proved this was provided by the German engineer Rudolf Gantenbrink as a result of measurements taken by his robot Upuat in March 1993. This was the robot that had made the startling discovery of a closed portcullis door blocking the shaft at a distance of about 200 feet from the Queen's Chamber. Equipped with a high-tech onboard clinometer, the little machine had also provided the first ever completely accurate reading of the shaft's angle of inclination, 39 degrees 30 minutes. As Bovell explains, quote, I did the calculations, and these established that the shaft had been targeted on the meridian transit of Sirius around the epoch 2400 BC. There couldn't be any doubt about it at all. I also recalculated the Orion's belt alignment worked out by Badawi and Trimble with new data that Gantenbrink gave me on the inclination of the southern shaft of the King's Chamber. He'd measured that at 45 degrees exactly, whereas Badawi and Trimble had worked with Flinders Petrie's slightly less accurate measure of 44 degrees 30 minutes. The new data enabled me to refine Badawi's and Trimble's date for the alignment. What I found was that the shaft had been precisely targeted at Al-Nitak, the lowest of the three belt stars, which crossed the meridian at latitude 45 degrees around the year 2475 BC. End quote. I have a problem with this theory. I have a big problem with this theory because they've been talking about the pyramids being built, possibly the pyramids and the Sphinx, possibly being built as 10,000 plus years ago. That would mean that there's no way that these could have been aimed at those particular stars in 2475 BC. They would have to have been aimed at something in 10,000 whatever it is BC. So unless it happens to be, like one or two rotations of the zodiac farther back in time, that it happens to be that they were pointed at that. I really don't see that theory. Well, it completely contradicts the theory that the pyramids are a lot older than they're thought to be. So, anyway, back to it. And maybe they'll get into that here in the text. I've never read the book, so I don't know. Up to this point, Bovell's conclusions had been well within the chronological bounds set by Orthodox Egyptologists, who normally dated the construction of the Great Pyramid to around 2520 BC. If anything, the alignments the archaeoastronomer had come up with suggested that the shafts had been built a little later rather than earlier than conventional wisdom allowed. As the reader is aware, however, Bovell had also made another discovery of an altogether more unsettling nature. Once again, it involved the stars of Orion's belt. Quote, they're slanted along a diagonal in a southwesterly direction relative to the axis of the Milky Way, and the pyramids are slanted along a diagonal in a southwesterly direction relative to the axis of the Nile. If you look carefully on a clear night, you'll also see that the smallest of the three stars, the one at the top, which the Arabs called Mintaka, is slightly offset to the east of the principal diagonal formed by the other two. This pattern is mimicked on the ground where we see the pyramid of Menkaure is offset by exactly the right amount to the east of the principal diagonal formed by the pyramid of Khafre, which represents the middle star Al-Nilam, and the Great Pyramid, which represents Al-Nitak. It's really quite obvious that all these monuments were laid out according to a unified site plan that was modeled with extraordinary precision on these three stars, which they did. What they did at Giza was to build Orion's belt on the ground. End quote. There was more to come. Using a sophisticated computer program capable of plotting the precessionally induced changes in the declinations of all the stars visible in the sky over any part of the world in any epoch, Bovell found that the pyramids/Orion's belt correlation was general and obvious in all epochs, but specific and exact in only one. And here we go. This is what I was talking about. Quote, at 10,450 BC, and at that date only, we find that the pattern of the pyramids on the ground provides a perfect reflection of the pattern of the stars in the sky. I mean, it's a perfect match, faultless, and it cannot be an accident because the entire arrangement correctly depicts two very unusual celestial events that occurred only at that time. First, and purely by chance, the Milky Way, as visible from Giza in 10,450 BC, exactly duplicated the meridional course of the Nile Valley. Secondly, to the west of the Milky Way, the three stars of Orion's belt were at the lowest altitude in their precessional cycle, with Al-Nitak, the star represented by the Great Pyramid, crossing the meridian at 11 minutes 8 seconds. And then we have a picture, and end quote. And then we have a picture, precession, and the stars of Orion's belt. So let me blow that up, and I'll show you. And it shows several things here. It's interesting. All right, so we've got the pyramid, we've got the position in 10,450 BC, the position in 2500 BC, and today. So it, it's aligned. It was aligned in 2500 BC, but not perfectly, and now it's way out of alignment. Is what I'm getting. Well, it's not way out of alignment. It's just not as well aligned. He did. I wish he'd um, continued that line up through to see, so we could see exactly how far off it is. Just with my eyeball, it looks like the line just barely misses the left edge of the star. Anyway, back to it. The reader is already familiar with the way the Earth's axial precession causes sunrise on the vernal equinox to migrate along the band of the zodiac over a cycle of about 26,000 years. The same phenomenon also affects the declination of all visible stars, producing, in the case of the Orion constellation, very gradual but significant changes in altitude. Thus, from its highest point at meridian transit 58 degrees 11 minutes above the southern horizon as viewed from Giza, it takes Al-Nitak about 13,000 years to descend to the low point, last registered in 10,450 BC, that is immortalized in stone on the Giza Plateau, i.e., 11 degrees 8 minutes. As another 13,000 years pass, the belt stars very slowly rise again until Al-Nitak is back at 58 degrees 11 minutes. Then, during the next 13,000 years, they gradually fall once more to 11 degrees 8 minutes. This cycle is eternal. 13,000 years up, 13,000 years down, 13,000 years up, 13,000 years down, forever. Quote, it's the precise configuration for 10,450 BC that we see on the Giza Plateau, as though a master architect came here in that epoch and decided to lay out a huge map on the ground using a mixture of natural and artificial features. He used the meridional course of the Nile Valley to depict the Milky Way, as it looked then. He built the three pyramids to represent the three stars exactly as they looked then, and he put the three pyramids in exactly the same relationship to the Nile Valley as the three stars then had to the Milky Way. It was a very clever, very ambitious, very exact way to mark an epoch, to freeze a particular date into architecture, if you like. End quote. The first time. I found the implications of the Orion correlation complicated and eerie. On the one hand, the Great Pyramid's southern shafts processionally anchored, quote unquote, the monument to Al-Nitak and Sirius in 2475 to 2400 BC dates, which coincided comfortably with the epoch when the Egyptologists said the monuments had been built. On the other hand, the disposition of all three of the pyramids in relation to the Nile Valley eloquently signaled the much earlier date of 10,450 BC. This coincided with the controversial geological findings John West and Robert Schoch had made at Giza, which suggested the presence of a high civilization in Egypt in the 11th millennium BC. Moreover, the disposition of the pyramids had not been arrived at by any random or accidental process, but seemed to have been deliberately chosen because it marked a processionally significant event, the lowest point, the beginning, the first time in Orion's 13,000-year up cycle. I knew that Bovell believed this astronomical event to have been linked symbolically to the mythical first time of Osiris, the time of the gods, when civilization had supposedly been brought into the Nile Valley, and that his reasoning for this derived from the mythology of ancient Egypt, which directly associated Osiris with the Orion constellation and Isis with Sirius. Had the historical archetypes for Osiris and Isis actually come here in the first time, 12,500 years ago? My research into Ice Age mythologies had persuaded me that certain ideas and memories could linger in the human psyche for many millennia, transmitted from generation to generation by oral tradition. I could therefore see no prima facie reasons why the Assyrian mythology, with its strange and anomalous characteristics, could not have originated as far back as 10,450 BC. However, it was the civilization of dynastic Egypt that had elevated Osiris to the status of the high god of resurrection. That civilization was one that had few known antecedents and none at all recognizable in the remote epoch of the 11th millennium BC. If the Osirian mythology had been transmitted across 8,000 years, therefore, then what culture had transmitted it? And had this culture also been responsible for both the astronomical alignments proven to have been manifested by the pyramids 10,450 BC and 2450 BC? And then we have a picture. The caption is "The Pyramids and the Belt Stars of Orion at 10,450 BC Meridian View." So let me bring that up. So here we have the stars in the upper part and the pyramids of the Giza Plateau in the lower. And there you see that smaller offset. Third star. Okay. These are among the questions I planned to put to Robert Bovell in the shadow of the pyramids. Santa and I had arranged to meet him at dawn at the mortuary temple of Khafre so that the three of us could watch the sun come up over the Sphinx. I tried to combine Phoenix and Sphinx for some reason there. The platform. Positioned beside the eastern face of the second pyramid, the largely ruined mortuary temple was a spooky, gray, cold place to be at this hour, and as John West had indicated during our conversation at Luxor, there could be little doubt that it belonged to the same severe, imposing, and unadorned style of architecture as the better-known Valley Temple. Here, at any rate, were the same enormous blocks weighing 200 tons or more each. And here, too, was the same intangible atmosphere of vast antiquity and awakening intelligence, as though some epiphany might be at hand. Even in its present much despoiled state, this anonymous structure, which Egyptologists had called a mortuary temple, was still a place of power that seemed to draw its energy from an epoch far in the past. I looked at the huge mass of the second pyramid's eastern face just behind us in the pearl gray dawn light. Again, as John West had pointed out, there was much to suggest that it might have been built in two different stages. The lower courses, up to the height of perhaps 30 feet, consisted largely of cyclopean limestone megaliths like those in the temples. Above this height, however, the remainder of the pyramid's gigantic core had been formed out of much smaller blocks weighing around 2 to 3 tons each, like the majority of the blocks in the Great Pyramid. Had there been a time when a 12-acre, 30-foot-high megalithic platform had stood here on the Hill of Giza, west of the Sphinx, surrounded only by nameless square and rectangular structures such as the valley and mortuary temples. In other words, was it possible that the second pyramid's lower courses might have been built first, before the other pyramids, perhaps long before, in a much earlier age? The cult. That question was still on my mind when Robert Bovell arrived. After exchanging a few chilly pleasantries about the weather, a cold desert wind was blowing across the plateau. I asked him, "How do you account for the 8,000-year gap in your correlations?" Gap? Yes, shafts that seem to have been aligned in 2450 BC and a site plan that maps star positions in 10,450 BC. "Actually, I see two explanations that both make some kind of sense," said Bovell, "and I think the answer has to be one or the other of these. Either the pyramids were designed as a sort of star clock to mark two particular epochs, 2450 and 10,450 BC, in which case we actually can't say when they were built, or they were built up over, and then the quote ends. Hang on with that first point, I interrupted. How do you mean star clock? How do you mean we can't say when they were built? Well, let's assume for a moment that the pyramid builders knew precession. Let's assume they were able to calculate the declination of particular star groups backwards and forwards in time, just as we can today with computers. Assuming that they could do that then, no matter which epoch they lived in, they'd have been able to make a model of what the skies over Giza looked like in 10,450 BC or 2450 BC as required, just as we could. In other words, if they built the pyramids in 10,450 BC, they would have had no difficulty in calculating the correct angles of inclination for the southern shafts so that they would be sited on Al-Nitak and Sirius around 2450 BC. Likewise, if they lived in 2450 BC, they'd have had no difficulty in calculating the correct site plan to reflect the position of Orion's belt in 10,450 BC. Agreed? Agreed. Okay, that's one explanation. But the second explanation, which I personally favor, and which I think the geological evidence also supports, is that the whole Giza necropolis was developed and built over an enormously long period of time. I think it's more than possible that the site was originally planned and laid out at around 10,450 BC, so that its geometry would reflect the skies as they looked then, but that the work was completed and the shafts of the Great Pyramid aligned around 2450 BC. So you're saying that the ground plan of the pyramids could date back to 10,450 BC? I think it does, and I think that the geometrical center of that plan was located more or less where we're standing right now, right in front of the second pyramid. I pointed out the large blocks in the lower course of the huge edifice. It even looks like it was built in two stages by two completely different cultures. Bovell shrugged. Let's speculate. Maybe it wasn't two different cultures. Maybe it was one culture or cult, the cult of Osiris, perhaps. Maybe it was a very long-lived, very ancient cult dedicated to Osiris that was here in 10,450 BC and was still here in 2450 BC. Maybe what happened was that some of the ways that this cult did things changed over time. Maybe they used huge blocks in 10,450 BC and smaller blocks in 2450 BC. It seems to me there's a lot here that supports this notion, a lot that says very ancient cult, a lot of evidence that has never been investigated. For example, well, obviously the astronomical alignments of the site. I've been among the first to start looking into those properly, and the geology, the work that John West and Robert Schoch have been involved in at the Sphinx. Here are two sciences, both hard, empirical, evidence-driven sciences that have never been applied to these problems before. But now that we have started to apply them, we're beginning to get a whole new reading on the antiquity of the necropolis, and I honestly think we've just scratched the surface, and that much more will emerge from the geology and the astronomy in the future. In addition, nobody's yet made a really detailed study of the pyramid texts from anything other than the so-called anthropological perspective, which means a preconceived notion that the priests of Heliopolis were a bunch of half-civilized witch doctors who wanted to live forever. Actually, they did want to live forever, but they certainly weren't witch doctors. They were highly civilized, highly initiated men, and they were, in their own fashion, scientists as we can judge from their works. Therefore, I suggest that it's as scientific, or at least quasi-scientific documents, that the pyramid texts need to be read, not as mumbo-jumbo. I'm already satisfied that they respond to processional astronomy. There may be other keys too: mathematics, geometry, particularly geometry, symbolism, What's needed is a multidisciplinary approach to understanding the pyramid texts and to understanding the pyramids themselves. Astronomers, mathematicians, geologists, engineers, architects, even philosophers to deal with the symbolism. Everybody who can bring a fresh eye and fresh skills to bear on these very important problems should be encouraged to do so. Why do you feel the problems are so important? Because they have a colossal bearing on our own understanding of the past of our own species. The very careful, very precise site planning and setting out that appears to have been done here in 10,450 BC could only have been the work of a highly evolved, probably technological civilization, whereas no civilization is supposed to have existed anywhere on Earth in that epoch. Exactly. It was the Stone Age. Human society was supposed to have been at a very primitive level, with our ancestors wearing skins, sheltering in caves, following a hunting gathering way of life, and so on and so forth. So it's rather unsettling to discover that civilized people seem to have been present in Giza in 10,450 BC who understood the obscure science of processional extremely well, who had the technical capacity to work out that they were witnessing the lowest point in Orion's precessional cycle, and thus the beginning of the constellation's 13,000-year upwards journey, and who set out to create a permanent memorial of that moment here on the plateau. By putting Orion's belt on the ground in the way that they did, they knew that they were freezing a very specific moment in time. A perverse thought occurred to me. How can we be so sure that the moment that they were freezing was 10,450 BC? After all, Orion's belt takes up the same configuration in the southern sky west of the Milky Way at 11 plus degrees above the horizon once every 26,000 years. So why shouldn't they have been immortalizing 36,450 BC or even the precessional cycle that began 26,000 years before that? Robert was clearly ready for this question. Some ancient records do suggest that Egyptian civilization had roots going back almost 40,000 years. He mused, like that strange report in Herodotus that talks about the sun rising where it once set and setting where it once rose, which is also a processional metaphor. Yes, procession again. Most peculiar the way it always keeps cropping up. At any rate, you're right. They could have been marking the beginning of the previous processional cycle. But do you think they were? No. I I think 10,450 BC is the more likely date. It's more within the range of what we know about the evolution of Homo sapiens, and although it still leaves a lot of years to account for before the sudden emergence of dynastic Egypt around 3000 BC, it isn't too long a period. Too long a period for what? It's the answer to your question about the 8,000-year gap between the alignment of the site and the alignment of the shafts. 8,000 years is a very long time, but it isn't too long for a dedicated, highly motivated cult to have preserved and nurtured and faithfully passed on the high knowledge of the people who invented this place in 10,450 BC. The machine. How high was the knowledge of these prehistoric inventors? They knew their epochs, said Bovell, and the clock that they used was the natural clock of the stars. Their working knowledge was processional astronomy, and these monuments express that language in a very clear, unambiguous, scientific manner. They were also highly skilled surveyors. I mean the people who originally prepared the site and laid out the orientations for the pyramids, because they worked to an exacting geometry and because they knew how to align the base platforms, or whatever it was they built, perfectly to the cardinal points. Do you think they also knew that they were working out the site of the Great Pyramid on latitude 30 degrees north? Bovell laughed. I'm certain they knew. I think they knew everything about the shape of the Earth. They knew their astronomy. They had a good understanding of the solar system and of celestial mechanics. They were also incredibly accurate and incredibly precise in everything they did. So, all in all, I don't think anything really happened here by chance, at least not between 10,450 BC and 2450 BC. I get the feeling that everything was planned, intended, carefully worked out. Indeed, I get the feeling that they were fulfilling a long term objective, some kind of purpose, if you like, and that they brought this to fruition in the third millennium BC. In the form of the fully built pyramids, which they then processionally anchored to Al-Natak and to Sirius at the time of completion? Yes, and also I think in the form of the pyramid texts. My guess is that the pyramid texts are part of the puzzle. The software to the pyramid's hardware? Quite possibly. Why not? At any rate, it's certain that there's a connection. I think that it mean I think what it means is that if we're going to decode the pyramids properly, then we're going to have to use the texts. What's your guess? I asked Bovell. What do you think the purpose of the pyramid builders really might have been? They didn't do it because they wanted an eternal tomb, he replied firmly. In my view, they had no doubts at all that they would eternally live. They did it, whoever did it. They have transmitted the power of their ideas through something that is, to all intents and purposes, eternal. They succeeded in creating a force that is functional in itself, provided you understand it, and that force is the questions it challenges you to ask. My guess is that they knew the human mind to perfection. They knew the game of ritual, right? I'm serious. They knew what they were doing. They knew that they could initiate people far ahead in the future into their way of thinking, even though they couldn't be there themselves. They knew that they could do this by creating an eternal machine, the function of which was to generate questions. We're getting there. We're getting there. A few more pages. I suppose that I must have looked puzzled. The machine is the pyramids, Bovell exclaimed. The whole of the Giza necropolis, really. And look at us. What are we doing? We're asking questions. We're standing out here shivering at an ungodly hour, watching the sun come up, and we're asking questions. Lots and lots of questions. Just as we've been programmed to do. We're in the hands of real magicians here, and real magicians know that with symbols, with the right questions, they can lead you into initiating yourself, provided that is you're a person who asks questions. And if you are, then the minute you start asking questions about the pyramids, you begin to stumble into a whole series of answers which lead you to other questions, and then more answers until finally you initiate yourself. Sow the seed. Yes, they were sowing the seed. Believe me, they were magicians, and they knew the power of ideas. They knew how to set ideas growing and developing in people's minds. And if you start with such ideas and follow the process of reasoning like I did, you arrive as things like Orion and 10,450 BC. In short, this is a process that works on its own. When it when it settles into the subconscious, it is a self-willing conversion. Once it's there, you can't even resist it. You're talking as though the Giza cult, whatever it was, revolving around procession and geometry and the pyramids and the pyramid text, you're talking as though it still exists. In a sense, it does still exist, Robert replied. Even if the driver is no longer at the wheel, the Giza necropolis is still a machine that was designed to provoke questions. He paused and pointed up to the summit of the Great Pyramid, where Santa and I had climbed at dead of night 9 months previously. Look at its power, he continued. 5,000 years on it still gets you. It involves you whether you like it or not. It forces you into a process of thinking, forces you to learn. The minute you ask a question about it, you've asked a question about engineering. You've asked a question about geometry. You've asked a question about astronomy. So it forces you to learn about engineering and geometry and astronomy. And gradually you begin to realize how sophisticated it is, how incredibly clever and skillful and knowledgeable its builders must have been, which forces you to ask questions about mankind, about human history, eventually about yourself too. You want to find out. This is the power of the thing. The second signature. As Robert, Santa, and I sat on the Giza Plateau that cold December morning at the end of 1993, we watched the winter sun, now very close to solstice, rising over the right shoulder of the Sphinx, almost as far south of east as it would travel on its yearly journey before turning north again. The Sphinx was an equinoctial marker, with its gaze directed precisely at the point of sunrise on the vernal equinox. Was it, too, part of the Giza grand plan? I reminded myself that in any epoch and at any period of history or prehistory, the Sphinx's due east gaze would always have been sighted on the equinoctial rising of the sun, at both the vernal and the autumnal equinoxes. As the reader will recall from Part 5, however, it was the vernal equinox that was considered by ancient man to be the marker of the astronomical age. In the words of Santayana and Van Deschend, quote, "The constellation that rose in the east just before the sun marked the place where the sun rested. It was known as the sun's carrier, and the vernal equinox was recognized as the fiducial point of the system determining the first degree of the sun's yearly cycle." End quote. Why should an equinoctial marker have been made in the shape of a giant lion? In our own lifetimes, the epoch of AD 2000, a more suitable shape for such a marker should should anyone wish to build one, would be a representation of a fish. This is because of the sun on the vernal equinox rises against the stellar background of Pisces, as it has done for approximately the last 2,000 years. The astronomical age of Pisces began around the time of Christ. Readers must judge for themselves whether it is a coincidence that the principal symbol used for Christ by the very early Christians was not the cross but the fish. During the preceding age, which broadly speaking encompassed the first and second millennium BC, it was the constellation of Aries, the ram, which had the honor of carrying the sun on the vernal equinox. Again, readers must judge whether it is a coincidence that the religious iconography of the epoch was predominantly ram-oriented. Is it a coincidence, for example, that Yahweh, God of Old Testament Israel, provided a ram as a substitute for Abraham's offered sacrifice of his son Isaac? Abraham and Isaac are assumed by biblical scholars and archaeologists to have lived during the early second millennium BC. Is it likewise coincidental that the rams, in one context or another, are referred to in almost every book of the Old Testament, entirely composed during the age of Aries, but in not a single book of the New Testament? And is it an accident that the advent of the age of Aries, shortly before the beginning of the second millennium BC, was accompanied in ancient Egypt by an upsurge in the worship of the god Ammon, whose symbol was a ram with curled horns? Work on the principal sanctuary of Ammon, or Ammon, the temple of Karnak at Luxor in Upper Egypt, was begun at around 2000 BC, and as those who have visited that temple will recall, its principal icons are rams, long rows of which guard its entrances. The immediate predecessor to the age of Aries was the age of Taurus, the bull, which spanned the period between 4380 and 2200 BC. It was during the processional epoch when the sun on the vernal equinox rose in the constellation of Taurus, that the bull cult of Minoan Crete flourished. And during this epoch, too, the civilization of dynastic Egypt burst upon the historical scene, fully formed, apparently without antecedents. Readers must judge whether it is a coincidence that Egyptians at the very beginning of the dynastic period were already venerating the Apis and the Nevis bulls, the former being considered a theophany of the god Osiris, and the latter the sacred animal of Heliopolis, a theophany of the god Ra. Why should an equinoctial marker have been made in the form of a lion? I looked down the slope of the Giza Plateau towards the great Leonin body of the Sphinx. Khafre, the 4th dynasty pharaoh believed by Egyptologists to have carved the monument out of bedrock around 2500 BC, had been a monarch of the age of Taurus. For almost 1800 years before his reign, and more than 300 years after it, the sun on the vernal equinox rose unfailingly in the constellation of the Bull. It follows that if a monarch at such a time had set out to create an equinoctial marker at Giza, he would have had every reason to have carved it in the form of a bull, and none whatsoever to have carved it in the form of a lion. Indeed, and it was obvious, there was only one epoch when the celestial symbolism of a Leonin equinoctial marker would have been appropriate. That epoch was, of course, the age of Leo, from 10,970 to 8810 BC. Why, therefore, should an equinoctial marker have been made in the shape of a lion? Because it was made during the age of Leo, when the sun on the vernal equinox rose against the stellar background of the constellation of the Lion, thus marking the coordinates of a precessional epoch that would not experience its great return for another 26,000 years. Around 10,450 BC, the 3 stars of Orion's belt reached the lowest point in their precessional cycle, west of the Milky Way, 11 degrees 8 minutes above the southern horizon at meridian transit. On the ground west of the Nile, this event was frozen into architecture in the shape of the 3 pyramids of Giza. Their layout formed the signature of an unmistakable epoch of precessional time. Around 10,450 BC, the sun on the vernal equinox rose in the constellation of Leo. On the ground at Giza, this event was frozen into architecture in the shape of the Sphinx, a gigantic Leonin equinoctial marker which, like the second signature on an official document, could be taken as a confirmation of authenticity. Then we have a picture, and then a little tiny bit, and we're done with this chapter and this section of the book. So, the picture is titled, or captioned, whatever you want to call it, Looking Due East at Dawn on the Vernal Equinox in 10,450 BC, the Sphinx and the constellation of Leo. So let me bring that up, blow it up a little bit so you can see it. And there you go. So that's okay. All right, let's finish this up. My voice is about done anyway, so it's perfect timing. The 11th millennium BC, in other words, soon after the mill of heaven broke, shifting sunrise on the spring equinox from Virgo into the constellation of Leo, was the only epoch in which the due east facing Sphinx would have manifested exactly the right symbolic alignment on exactly the right day. Watching the vernal sun rising in the dawn sky against the background of his own celestial counterpart. Forcing the question. It can't be a coincidence that such a perfect alignment of the terrestrial and the celestial occurs at around 10,450 BC, said Robert. In fact, I don't think coincidence is any longer an issue. To me, the real question is why? Why was it done? Why did they go to such lengths to make this enormous statement about the 11th millennium BC? Obviously, because it was an important time for them, suggested Santha. It must have been very, very important. You don't do something like this, create a series of vast processional markers like these, carve a sphinx, put up 3 pyramids weighing almost 15 million tons, unless you have some vaguely important reason. I read it as vaguely, hugely important reason. I'm sorry. So the question is, what was that reason? They forced this question by making such a strong imperative statement about 10,450 BC. Really, they've forced the question. They want to draw our attention to 10,450 BC, and it's up to us to work out why. We fell silent for a long while as the sun climbed the sky southeast of the Great Sphinx. And that is the end of part 7 of the book, and of that chapter, obviously. So, conclusion, where's the body, is the last part of the book. There are 3 long chapters. Well, the first one's relatively mid-length. The other 2 are quite long, about as long as this last chapter was, both of them. So, but we'll be able to get through that on Tuesday. That'll finish out the book, and I will figure out between now and then what I'm going to read next. I have a list I've already made up. Actually, no, I already know what I'm going to read. I am going to read the second book in the Problem of Slavery series by David Bryan Davis, the Problem of Slavery in the Age of Revolution. I don't have it in physical form. I only have it in electronic format. But I will be reading that one next. I've already figured that out. So, anyway, let's see who's around. Is there anybody still on this late that we can go and raid? Let's see. Who's around? Who's around? Who's around? Anybody? Well, Hot Dog's still on. Hot Dog, Raw Dog. Let's see. Yeah, okay. Let's go to Hot Dog, Raw Dog. We haven't. Need some more soul? Yeah, we do need some more soul. But I had already decided I wanted to read this. I haven't read one of these slavery books in like 2 years, so I wanted to read it. But I will definitely be throwing in some more Thomas Sowell for absolute certain. So maybe I will just pick something to read after the Problem of Slavery in the Age of Revolution. If you haven't watched or Anson Murray, I've been looking for Murray's books. I've got a few of them now. Had trouble finding a couple of them. I'm trying to do this as cheaply as possible because I don't make any money at this. So anyway, let's go on over and raid Hot Dog Raw Dog. He's playing Sonic Racing. Not a game I really have any interest in, but we'll go raid him anyway. I will take us on over there, and we'll see you there.
finished a little bit better. I botched up the end, as you saw. Botched up the end of that race. I gained